Rebecca, your precision about time reminded me of Michael Dukakis,
for whom I'm often mistaken.
The first time I ever saw Seattle was when we came in on his campaign plane, which I was covering as a journalist. And at the time, his wife Kitty was writing a book, and her editor was my editor at the time, Alice Mayhew. And she said, I found out everything I needed to know about Michael when I called when they were back from the campaign flights at their home. And I was calling Kitty about changes in the book. And Michael said, oh, call back because she's in the shower. She'll be out in 13 minutes. But it was wonderful to come into Seattle, 1988, because he had just had the debate, presidential candidate debate, in Los Angeles, where he was asked if his wife were raped and murdered, would he change his views on capital punishment? And he said, no, Bernie, you know, I've always been against capital punishment, and that was that. And his staff, you could just see them collapsing in panic. And the journalists just looked at, so we got on the plane to fly up here, and several movie stars came along, and staff would circulate them into the front section to try to cheer him up. He realized that, of course, just from the faces of everybody around him on the plane, what had happened. And Tom Hayden was one of the people, and he went into the front part, and when he came out, I said, what's your role here? And he said, to keep you guys out of his face. Anyway, we landed and rushed to a beautiful site on the water, bright lights, big band playing, and it lifted his spirit, the staff told me later. There was a slight drizzle, so it was kind of glittery in the bright lights, and it looked like a magic land, so I thought, I've got to come back and see this place again. That was the best visit until my last visit when I met Rebecca, when that's the highlight of Seattle for my money. Well, now about the Pope.
After me.
What's not to like about Pope Francis? He disappoints Catholic liberals like me, but he scares the pants off conservatives. They have reacted in panic, and no wonder. It is a bit disorienting to have a pope who is actually a Christian.
Zing, zing.
Some on the right reassure themselves that he is changing the tone of Catholicism, but not the doctrine. And for them, religion is all about doctrine. If you do not hold the right doctrines, you can't be a Catholic. So, since the Pope is a Catholic, though they are beginning to hesitate on that, he must hold all the right doctrines. The only thing he can change is the tone. Well, rather than tone, I would prefer to talk about changing the culture of religion, the entire ethos of believing as an exercise of the heart, not only the head. As he told his Jesuit interrogators in that long interview he did with them, quote, the structural and organizational reforms are secondary. The first reform must be in attitude. Francis signals a culture change in everything he does, in what he calls himself, in where he lives, in what he wears, and what he rides. First, his name. No pope has been called Francis. When he came in second at the conclave that chose Benedict, we tend to forget that. He didn't come out of nowhere. He was actually the second largest vote getter after Ratzinger. He was asked back then, had he been elected, what name would he have chosen? And he said, John the 24th. So we knew something about him even then. But in the intervening 8 years, he had more time to think about the importance of the symbolic name of a pope. And he chose Francis. No other pope, and was named that, and for good reason. Francis was a subversive, too radical even for his own followers, who worked very hard to tame down the demands that he made upon them. He was not even a priest. How can the church's own super priest, the Pope, want to be named for a man who was never ordained and never in any kind of church hierarchy? How can the center of church stability embrace such risk? Second, where he lives. The fact that Francis is not living in the papal palace, but in the Casa Santa Marta, has mainly been discussed in terms of luxury versus austerity. But that's not what he emphasizes. He explained his choice saying, "I cannot live alone. I must live my life with others." Popes rarely say they need others. The elaborate entry rituals of a palace dramatize the ruler's apartness. Authority proves its importance by not being easily accessible. It's to show us the ruler is self-sufficient, self-authenticating. Francis takes all kinds of measures, like placing his own phone calls, eating at the common table in Casa Santa Marta, to say that he is like you or me. The Casa Santa Marta is a place of transience. It was built in 1996 to house cardinals when they meet to elect a new pope. Before that, they had slept on cots divided by curtains in the halls and offices of the papal palace. In the Casa Santa Marta, during a conclave, they have no communication with the outside world by telephone, radio, TV. The rooms are equal and assigned by lot. While attending the conclave with his fellow cardinals, Jorge Bergoglio had room 201. After his election as Pope, he just moved to the slightly larger room 207, from which he comes to the communal dining room. He celebrates Mass in the adjacent chapel, not in any of the big altars in the Vatican. Now, he has to go to receptions in the papal palace where official functions go on and crowds arrive. But he's a visitor there. It's not his home. He's like the people he is receiving. There's deep meaning in this arrangement. Before, when people went to the Pope's residence, it was like a goal of pilgrimage to the center of ecclesiastical grandeur. In the Casa Santa Marta, the Pope, too, is a traveler, living with his fellow pilgrims. Third, what he wears. As a palace sets a man apart, so do ceremonial garments. Francis has to wear some papal regalia, but he keeps things as simple as possible. He remembers perhaps that Jesus never wore any ecclesiastical garment, nor did priests or bishops for centuries. You know, now if you see a picture, a painting, a statue of St. Augustine of Hippo, 4th into the 5th centuries, he's got all of the trappings of a medieval bishop, mitre and crozier and gloves and ring and slipper. Augustine didn't wear any of those things. He wore street clothes, donated often from the common lot that his fellow Christians wore. Now, Francis will have to continue the tradition of mitre and crozier, but he keeps it as simple as he can. One can't imagine him using the Capa Magna, which Cardinal Raymond Burke loves to wear, the one with a train so long that a flunky has to carry the tail of it around after him. In shedding as much as he can, Francis is performing a kind of spiritual striptease. Like Francis, his namesake, who threw off his father's rich robes and went into the world wearing rags. My wife and I, when we were at Assisi, looked at through the glass where his last robe is wearing, and it was patched and raggedy. garment. I think this Pope would rather wear that than a lot of the things that he has to wear now. Fourth, what he rides. Francis cannot travel around Rome by bus and subway as he did as an archbishop and a cardinal in Buenos Aires, though he took the bus with his fellow cardinals to go back to Casa Santa Marta after he was elected. In his first trip into Rome, his diocese as Bishop of Rome, he was not in a limousine escorted by Vatican police cars. He was inside a police car. Even on the papal airplane, he mingles with journalists as no other pope has done. It is typical that when he was called to the conclave, he was sent a first-class ticket. He traded it in for coach. He likes to be with the people. He says, if we're shepherds, we have to have the smell of the sheep. And you can't get that in the rectory. You've got to go out to them to find out what they are thinking. Well, but are such gestures enough? Some people are impatient for him to change things more rapidly. I know a number of people who are either victims of sexual predators in the priesthood or they're advocates, lawyers, or organizers, and they're disappointed in him. They want him to get going. So he's not pleasing liberals as well as conservatives, but pleasing either of us is not his assignment. It would be a mistake for him to take sides with the Catholic left or right, so far as they exist. And he knows that. He cannot join the right because they're just too mean. Ecclesiastical conservatives like to punish, to exclude, to use doctrine as a weapon. Their typical action is to deny the sacraments to politicians who are not doctrinally correct. On this, the Pope has written, the Eucharist is not a prize for perfect behavior, but a powerful medicine for the weak. He has also said that the church should be like a field hospital out on a battle. If you go out and see the fallen, you don't go over to them and ask them, are you with us? You go over and address the wounds and start working on them right away. The Catholic right is more like people who go out onto the battlefield and shoot the wounded. Francis's distance from such people is expressed in his first major document so far, The Joy of the Gospel. Rather than, this is quoting him, rather than experts in dire predictions, dour judges bent on rooting out every threat and deviation, we should appear as joyful messengers of challenging proposals, guardians of the goodness and beauty which shine through the gospel. On the other hand, he shouldn't join the left either, because we're too snooty. We're like the smarty pants at a party, the know-it-all. The effects of Vatican II were slowed down by papal reactionaries, but also by liberal know-it-alls. We were too quick to throw out practices that the people loved. Francis says, when you go to the people, you want to know what they love so that you can love along with them. So it was disappointing or disorienting to some to throw out fasting or novenas or Marian devotions. Francis, like John the 23rd, likes folk religion, which he calls popular piety. In his sparely appointed room at the Casa Santa Marta, he has a statue of Our Lady of Lujan, who protects Argentina. This is quoting him again. Expressions of popular piety have much to teach us for those who are capable of reading them. They are locus theologicus, which demands our attention, especially at a time when we are looking to the new evangelization. The Pope's office is not that of a prophet. Sometimes he's going to do things that displease us, wherever we stand in the church. It's not his job to please us. He must maintain a continuity in the life of the church. He has to stay with his predecessors, not depart from them. After all, no other pope has ever, in our whole long history, had a living pope next door, living ex-pope. There were ex-popes living, but they were normally thrown into dungeons. This one is undisgraced. Pope John the 23rd did not change the church by fiat from the top. He called in bishops for a council, and the bishops called in a whole generation of theologians who had been silenced by Pius XII. We can see the same spirit in the Pope's handling of the 2014 Synod of Bishops. When a preliminary report of the proceedings was leaked to the press, it indicated a relaxing of language on gays and on communion for the divorced. Conservative bishops in the Synod reacted to that and worked very hard to water the statement down. That was taken as a rebuke to Francis, or a setback. Instead, he congratulated the bishops for speaking their minds. He said, that's the way we progress, by learning from each other. And he said, he had before that said, canvass your communities before you come to the thing. Find out what the laity are thinking, what your communities are thinking. And then he gave a final speech, which John Allen, great Vaticanologist, said is one of the best he's ever given. But he said, this is a preliminary synod, and we'll be preparing for the next one. And so everybody should know everything that was said and publish the whole proceedings. You know, up to that point, the synods were set up by the Second Vatican Council as an expression of collegiality, that the bishops come together and steer the church, as they did at the great councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon and other things. It was the bishops, not a pope, who guided the church. But in this case, John Paul said, all right, you can have the synods, but they have to be secret. And you can issue a report, but only to me, and I will do what I want with it, change it or ignore it. This pope says, no, let's find out how everybody voted. And now, in the next synod, all those bishops are going to go in knowing everybody will know what I say and how I vote. And the reaction to the first synod shows where the world at large stands on many of these issues. Pope Francis rightly sees that his mission is not just to Catholics, but to all believers in Jesus, and even to non-believers. In Buenos Aires, he had close ties to the Jews of the city, and even closer ties with the Muslims. He prayed in a mosque. He went to the funeral of the sheikh, and the gestures he's made toward the Muslims are very important now. In the Joy of the Gospel, he says the Quran is a great spiritual classic, and spiritual treasures have been built up through the years by those who live with it. Because after all, there's only one God. Some call him Yahweh, some call him Allah, some call him Theos or Christos, but it's the same God, and he made us all. He knows what Senator Lindsey Graham does not know, that we are not going to have a holy war with 1.5 billion Muslims all around the world. And for a very good reason. You know, Gallup did an extremely thorough and expensive survey of 35 countries that were mainly or heavily Muslim. And they sent a questionnaire that said, do you approve of what was done in the bombing of the World Trade Center? 7% said yes. 93% said no. So it would be crazy if we go to war with the 93% for what the 7% did. And the Pope has made it very clear that that's high among his priorities, to prevent, if he can, or contribute to the effort, not to have a holy war. If he is able to have an impact on that subject, it may be the most world historically important thing he's doing at this moment. It will make him worthy of his namesake, the Saint of Assisi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wills.
Dr. Wills, come on. Come on.
And I put a jacket on. Come on, give me a chance.
All right, no, you're going to pretend you're not my pal just because you're questioning me, right?
Okay, Garry. So I just, the two things that jumped out at me first about some of your comments, and one was this, near the end of your book, you've got the chapter about the Pope of Surprises, Francis as a Pope of Surprises. You've got those wonderful quotations from the Pope about surprises. And then you go through this litany of these things that Francis has done, is doing in terms of publicly visible things of changing a style, like not staying in a fancy house, not wearing the ermine. And so I guess it's like, he's a Pope of surprises. And I have to go back. Chris and I were watching the Colbert Report earlier today when you were on the Colbert Report.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, and then they were like, Colbert was like, do you want a new Pope? And you're kind of like, and he kind of goes, so you, after Benedict, you'd be happy for Pope Nobody the First, like, you don't care who the Pope is. Mm-hmm. Have you been surprised by the sort of, by your happiness about this Pope?
Oh, definitely. I said, people around Washington are certainly reminding me of this. I said before the election of the Pope, we shouldn't make such a big thing of it, because the Pope is not the Church. And the way the coverage of the thing was that we hear always when there's a conclave, the whole world's press runs there and says, this is an important thing. After all, he's going to be a successor to St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome. There was no Bishop of Rome in Peter's time. I mean, nobody's going to say that at that time, but the whole myth of the Pope, I said, is something that we should not build up. Well, this is a Pope who agrees with that. He undercut me.
He's stealing all your lines.
Yeah, right. He is also saying, as John the 23rd did, I'm not the Church. Don't sit around and wait for me to give you orders. You have to live. And of course, that's how the Church has changed a good deal, as I say in the book. Deep changes have come about in the Church very often, not by papal reversal of anything. It's come about because people just stopped doing it. They realized that this was not relevant to their spiritual life as they actually lived it. So we didn't have a formal renunciation of the idea that taking interest on a loan will send you to hell. That was a very powerful position. If you've ever been in Padua and gone to the Arena Chapel, you see this great, beautiful thing painted all inside by Giotto by a son of a banker who put it up in repentance for the usury of his father, because he took loans, took interest on loans. That was not formally renounced. We just stopped paying any attention. The same thing is true about indulgences. It's not formally been revoked, and John Paul made a couple of efforts to revive it. But we no longer believe that if you run into a church on a certain day, you'll get X amount of time off of purgatory service.
Wait, say that again? I joined the wrong church!
Interdicts, there was no formal renunciation of that. That was a horrible, cruel thing, that when the Pope was a king and had realms and armies and torturers and spies, and he fought with another king, in order to get his way, he would say, unless you come over to my view of this matter, no sacraments will be dispensed to your subjects. They'll die without last rites. They'll not be able to go to confession or communion or anything in the whole realm. That was, I should put it this way, when Pius IX said that democracy and free speech and a free press were evil, Prime Minister of England, Gladstone, said, my God, these people are against me because we are a democratic constitutional monarchy. They won't pay any attention to me. And Lord Acton, the great Catholic historian, said, oh, don't worry. When our popes go crazy, we don't pay any attention. This pope is working against the myth of the pope, which I had no way to anticipate, and he has struck down all my defenses.
It sounds like, as I've learned to say, the Holy Spirit's at work. It's interesting that you talk about Lord Acton and the idea of the sort of public and political perception of the power of the Pope. Acton, of course, is one of your intellectual heroes. I think I would also list Augustine, Chesterton, Newman, John the 23rd. I mean, these are guys you reference both a lot in this book and in, particularly in Papal Sin, which in some ways I'm going to consider volume 1 of this book, or the Old Testament of this book. So there's but I'm trying to get behind this idea of some kind of irony between, on the one hand, there's a kind of this new book starts off with the idea that part of the Catholic Church seems to fear change, and then you've got this great line, which is a little bit of a kind of, which is, from that vantage point, a changing church is simply not the Catholic Church. Immutability must be built into its DNA, like the church always was and always shall be. Next paragraph begins. It helps, comma, in holding such a view, comma, not to know much history. Okay, second paragraph of this book begins with that. And so I love these, because it's a very considered and obviously very knowledgeable piece of work, but there's also these little lines that can almost you kind of go, oh. So there's something about knowing history and relying on previous thinkers that are kinds of heroes. And at the same time, there's also this notion of the necessity of moving forward from history, not being stopped by history. I mean, the Papal Sin, several books ago, was about structures of deceit that had developed over a long time. And this was about the possibility of changing those things. But in order to know that change is possible, you have to look back that change always existed. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And so, is this the potential of a new church? Is this a continuity, or is this shift to one degree, to one direction or the other?
Well, the forces for stability and for venturing out are always there in various ways in various parts of the church. I should say, some people have taken it that I say the people of God is always right and the popes are always wrong. That's certainly not true. The church has sinned in its entirety in many times, as all of the leaders of the church in the New Testament have. Peter has and others have. But the Pope alone, for instance, could not have reversed one of the worst sins of the church. Not only the Catholic Church, by the way. Luther and Calvin were terrible on this too. The cruel persecution of Jews. The whole idea that the Jews were a cursed race because they killed Christ. All the Jews did it. It's the way all the Muslims blew up the World Trade Center. But, you know, Pope John the 23rd or anyone else could not have reversed that. It was so strong in the liturgy and other things. And when the Second Vatican Council took it on and confessed to the sin, there was a great resistance to that. How could we have been so horribly wrong for so long? And it took the Second Vatican Council with great internal fights, people saying, no, 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 you can't say that about the church, or even the scripture, that the New Testament is anti-Semitic, parts of it are very anti-Semitic. So the encouraging thing about change is we can't get out of a trap like that. We can't renounce the sin if we just keep going. So it was hard enough for the Second Vatican Council to do it. If the Pope had tried to do it just by fiat, it wouldn't have worked. It would have caused more rancor and bitterness. This is a case where the whole church did have to cope with this tremendous problem. Now, I've heard people trying to say, well, the church itself didn't change. I don't know who they're talking about, because there was no part of the church that was free of that sin. And of course, I always get, then you really must hate the church. You don't hate anything that's been so horrible for so long. Well, think of America. We have great historic sins on our conscience, or we should. Slavery. Slavery was something in which everyone was complicitous in one way or another. After all, 12 of our presidents held slaves, including our great ones, Washington, Jefferson, Madison. They were all slaveholders, and we elected them, so we were complicit in it. There's no way that you can make up for that. People talk about reparations, you know, the scale of it is too immense. All you can do is recognize the sin and try to repent in various ways. Same thing is true about the extrusion of the Indians, kicking them out or killing them. Same thing is true about the suppression of women, about the suppression of gays. We as Americans are complicit in all of those things. That doesn't mean we don't love America, or that there are not lovable things as well as horrible things. The same thing is true of the church. It has tremendous sins in which we've all been complicit. You know, the people who want him, for instance, this Pope, to solve the pedophile problem, you know, they want him to punish individuals. The trouble with millions of troubles with the pedophile situation, the ruining of young lives, but the covering it up, the denying it, for a long, long time saying, no, 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 it's not happening, or it's not happening on that scale, or it's only in America. Everybody in the hierarchy was complicit in that. I didn't hear a single bishop get up and say, we as a body have been covering up a great crime. And their attempts to deny or reduce it or ignore it, I had priest after priest tell me in various places, oh, they're exaggerating the problem, the press loves this, and the lawyers are in it for the money, and they're prompting all these people to come out 20 or 25 years afterward. And it was a tremendous complicity. In a way, the only thing that this Pope could do to make up for it is kick out all the bishops. They all helped cover it up by not denouncing it, by trying to diminish it. There were no heroes in this story. So what, as I say, John the 23rd could not have solved the anti-Semitic sin. This Pope can't solve the pedophile sin. It's going to be, he's calling together groups to study. He's trying to make some recognition. He's interviewed at great length 2 victims who came out saying that he, more than any of the priests or churchly people they've dealt with, really listened and understood them. So this is not something that you can solve by a fiat, you know. And I ask SNAP people who want quick action, what kind of directive could he issue? You would have to cover, how do you identify genuine victims, the degree of victimhood, the kind of response it will need, therapeutic reparations, etc. How do you protect the rights of the accused? They're not all guilty just because a lot of them are. What kind of gradation of recompense are you going to do? How do you judge? This was slightly damaging to the whole future life of a child, and this was totally destructive, so we've got to work out exactly a scale. You can't do it. It would be impossible, and taking great things down to small. My house was just ruined by a terrible accident, and the insurance company came running in and waved a big check at us and said, well, this will cover it. And of course it was totally inadequate, and we're still working out what we're going to do to restore the whole house. It was just gutted. Well, in that, if the Pope suddenly said, here's a directive on what went wrong there, it would be like the insurance guy saying, in effect trying to shut us up by saying, that's over, we've solved it. Living in history means living with sin, and the church has done that, as all parts of humanity have. When President Obama said, there are things that are terribly violent in the Quran. He says, there are things in our history that are terribly violent. Of course, there are a lot in our scripture, too. But of course, he was attacked. He doesn't love America, because he's saying we had terrible injustices inflicted on people in our name. And of course, it's still going on in all kinds of ways. But there was an attempt, a recurrent one, to say the church was above all that. The church was a perfect society, said Thomas Aquinas. And, you know, some of its representatives might be wrong, but the church itself is our spotless mother. Nope.
Full of, I guess it was a subtitle of that, of your papal sin book, Structures of Deceit, and I think to change a structure is a much more long-term, deep-rooted thing than sort of ousting an individual. So surprise and history. Another thing that you referenced in your talk you read from this evening is the sort of popular piety of that Francis is sort of showing that in some of his devotions. And I know that your practice of the rosary is very important to you. Of course, you've written a book on it and have acknowledged that I think you say that you do the rosary daily and during Lent, the Sorrowful Mysteries. So I'm curious about what your perception is about under Francis, the sort of, I don't want to say elevation of popular piety, because that seems to be a contradiction in terms, but the sort of opening up or no longer a shame of popular piety. And
well, John the 23rd was that way too, you know. And this Pope says, if you love the people, you love what they love. And so he knows that it's very important in Argentina that the people love Our Lady of Lojan. And so it's part of the smell of the sheep. You have to join them in all, you know, unless there's some really distorted spirituality, which can happen in some cases. We've had our fanatical kind of devotions too, but he says you have to show God's love by your action and what you say, and that means that you have to talk their language. See, he much admires the Jesuits who in America with the Indians, in China, in India, tried to translate our concepts into their language, not simply the words, but the cultural resonances, saying there is an equivalent in your religious feelings of what we present as the way to love God. And of course that was silenced by the popes at the time. The Jesuit, it is one of the reasons the Jesuit order was suppressed by the popes.
By a Franciscan. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So that's another part of the popes choosing that name as a sort of coming together of these unexpected historic adversaries.
In that sense, the cultural change that he's making is the same that the Jesuits were trying to make back then. He says if we're talking to American Catholics, they already have certain practices they love, so we should respect that. That's, again, saying I'm not going to cut off attempts to reach people because we haven't done it that way in the past. One of the things this Pope has said is, I don't like to hear, we've never done it.
It sounds like a vacuum waiting to be filled. Let's try it this way. I mean, speaking of language, one of the sections of your book is about the history of Latin in the church. And when we were talking earlier, of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic, and New Testament was Greek, and Old Testament was Hebrew, and then Latin came in. I sort of never put the pieces together before your book that, you know, Jerome sort of made this Latin Vulgate, but that didn't just come out of nowhere. There were different Latin versions around. And then you talk about how Latin was used or sort of idealized as a sort of universal language, and indeed it was for the intelligentsia of a certain time, and then how as culture changed, the sort of usefulness of Latin changed, and how the church took a long time to, by the church I mean institutions and systems of it, how the church took a long time to change from that. So I'm curious about your notion about, can one talk about universality of the Catholic Church these days? I mean, in a way that Latin used to be regarded as a universal language for the Church. What is there universality in this global Facebook world? Or do we have to be more Catholic with a small c?
The Latin was a false universality because For one thing, it excluded the body of believers. Most people didn't know Latin. A lot of people in the period that it's covered were illiterate in any language. But the idea that it was part of the centralizing monarchy that the papacy became, that they wanted to have this one language for all kind of, you can't think in your own language, you have to come and learn ours. That's so much against the whole meaning of Pentecost. After all, the message of that was that we're going to be a universal church, not by speaking one language, but by speaking every language. The only universality is that in whatever language you're using, you're trying to express love of God and of your neighbor. And if you're doing that, that will unite you with other people. The idea of that, one way to do it, I'm sure you all know people who have that attitude. If you're going to do it, you're going to do it my way.
Sounds good to me.
That brings me to one of the most neglected passages in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Luke, the first time Jesus sends people out, the disciples out without him, they come back to him and he said, well, how did it go? And they say, it was wonderful. We cast out devils, we healed, we spread the kingdom. But we came across, this is John the Apostle speaking to Jesus, we came across a man who was casting out devils in your name, but he wasn't one of us. So we made him stop. And Jesus said, why did you do that? He was doing it in my name. He was not against me. So all that time when Protestants were doing things in the name of Jesus and Catholics said, no, that's not right. You're not one of us. Or the Protestants said the same thing about the Catholics. Or the evangelicals said it about the ritualists. This Pope doesn't think of himself as an autocrat in any way about Catholics or others. One of the main things that the church has to cope with in places like Latin America is the surge of evangelicals. That's often presented as a challenge, something to be fought. Archbishop Bergoglio went to the evangelicals and knelt and asked their blessing. There's a picture in the paper of him kneeling for the blessing of these other people because they were doing it in the Lord's name. So the universality is not one that tries to limit things to one culture or one way of doing it. Or it's trying to speak the language of love, which you have to learn. One of the things that this Pope says over and over again is, it's more our job to listen than to speak. If you don't hear what the problems are of your people that you're trying to serve, you'll never be able to do anything about them.
That might be the perfect time to ask if there are questions for you to listen to here. Dr. Wills, do we have a little time for a Q&A? I think we've got a couple of mics set up somewhere. Mics on both sides.
I can't even see them from here.
Okay, first question.
Thank you. Dr. Wills, it sounds like the theme of transience resonates in your books. I could think it was just this past week or two, the Pope announced that he thought that his term was going to be very limited, that he could foresee himself leaving in the next 3 to 5 years. And I was wondering what you thought about that and how that fits in this whole reform and who would come after him and whether there was a larger plan.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why people have made such a thing of that. Of course he's not going to be around a long time because he's my age. We're 79 and we know we hope to live for a while, but we know we're coming down toward the end. He's also very good and close to Benedict. They're neighbors after all. And he admires, as he should, the fact that Benedict gave up the power when he felt that he was not fully able to cope with it. The great leaders are ones who don't become captives of their own myth. George Washington said he wouldn't have wanted, aside from the fact that he had tried to resign the first time, and the popular pressure made him run for a second time. And of course, the popular pressure was on for him to run a third time. And he said, I don't think I will be capable if I try to come up with another 4 years. Now that's just common sense. That's not, and it was admirable for Benedict to do that, because he's saying, this is a tough job, and if you are not in full command of yourself, you probably can't do it. He watched as John Paul II deteriorated from a very strong, radiating energy pope to a very, very weakened and practically indecipherable pope. And he didn't want that to happen to him or to the church. So I think he's just saying, he's not saying, I'm going to put you in, I'm going to only give you 3 or 4 years because I have other things to do. I think he's saying Benedict set a very good example. And if I get so that I feel that I can't do it, then I would like to follow that great example.
Sorry, let's take a question from here, and then we'll come back here. Yep.
Hi, thank you. In Mexico, for about the last decade, an average of 1,300 Catholics have fallen away every day. And since 1950, I think the percentage of folks who call themselves Mexican has dropped from about 90% to 69%. No, to 84%. But anyway, in Latin America as a whole, it's down to about 69%. And so I'm just curious as to whether, well, and some of the reasons that, its surveys have shown that some of the reasons people have fallen away is that they desire a greater personal relationship with God, a little more material help, a different style of worship. And I'm just curious as to whether you believe or you think that Pope Francis is worried about this, and if he is likely to, being a Latin American himself, to reverse this trend.
Well, I hope he doesn't see that as a threat, that if other people are worshiping God and leaving us to do that, then the church has failed. His attitude is, if they're finding spiritual riches, we should join them. We should go out to them. The great sin, one of the great sins of Christianity in general, is Christians killing Christians. Jesuits being hanged by Church of England rulers.
Which is talked about so much in your 2 books ago, making make-believe real, 2 books ago. Is that for sale over there too? Yes? Okay.
So the whole idea that we're in a competition, and if they don't do it our way, we'll say that they're not true Christians. That's been a sin practiced by Lutherans, and there was mutual persecution for century after century. If you're not my kind of Christian, you don't have Jesus. We have Jesus, you don't. This Pope doesn't think that way. He says the Jews, the Muslims, and even the unbelievers.
And the atheists, yep.
Even the unbelievers are all made by God, addressed by God. We have to go and try to find God in them and help if we can. to teach them and learn what they can teach us. He's a very humble man, because he was not so humble only as a provincial of the Jesuits. He said that himself. I was not ready. They shouldn't have put me there. It was crazy for them to do that. But what a lesson he learned from that. And when he became the Archbishop, one of the things is, he had a very difficult position. It was when the military government in Argentina was raging the dirty war. So all of his Jesuits and others were in tremendous danger, and he tried to reduce that danger, naturally. But that meant, don't stay in positions where you're likely to be martyred. And some wanted to stay there, and they had a lot of support from their fellow Jesuits. So he caused great resentment in his own order by the fact that he was playing it safe. He felt he had to, and admits he was not mature in how he steered things. But that rift was never healed until he became Pope. He had planned to go into a retirement home when he ended his bishopry, and to be buried in a cemetery that were not Jesuit. But of course, once he became Pope, he called the Jesuit general, called him over, and then for 3 days, he did a 6-hour interview with the editors of the Jesuit papers, and of course, now all the wounds are healed. And he doesn't have to worry where he's going to be buried now.
Next question, sir.
So since Lincoln at Gettysburg, at least, you've been referred to as a public intellectual. And I would guess that since Papal Sins and Why I Am a Catholic, and now with this one, you can be called, or have been called, an ecclesiastical gadfly. If you don't want to accept those epithets, or even if you do, who would you rank among the public intellectuals, either nationally or internationally, and among the ecclesiastical gadflies internationally?
I'm not good at ranking. Gerald Posner, do you know him? He's the judge in Illinois. He's a very smart man, very influential, pretty conservative, though not so much now. But he wrote a book on the public intellectuals, and he ranked them. I was 79, so I was not. But it's a very artificial exercise, as most people pointed out. The way he ranked them was number of citations in scholarly journals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was all by the count. That doesn't mean much to me. I've met Judge Posner, and I like him, but there was one time he was being given an honorary degree from my university, Northwestern, and so was the radio host at the time, Studs Terkel. And Studs doesn't think much about Judge Posner, because Posner said we should adopt an economic model for the law and think of human freedom as the market. And that didn't appeal to Studs. So I was the person who was going to present Studs, and the university people called up Studs and said, you're going to accept at dinner, you're going to express the gratitude of all the people getting an honorary degree. Do you have a problem with that with Judge Posner? And he said, no, of course not. We disagree on some things, but I'll be glad to speak for the body of them. But when we were putting on the gowns, dressing room before going out to the graduation ceremony, Studs was very hard of hearing at that point and became almost deaf after. But he, with a lot of people who are hard of hearing, they hear what they expect to hear. So he said, well, let's go over and say hello to Judge Posner. You know, we're all just milling around in the dressing room. And so he said to Posner, now that you're a judge, do you still teach at the University Law School, which Studs himself had graduated from? And he said, yes. And he said, well, what's your course this term? And he said, evidence. And Studs said, avarice?
I have two short questions. I saw you in Charlie Rose some time ago, and you were talking about our two wars, and I was wondering if you've changed your mind on that. And the second...
Which two wars?
Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
And the second question is there any serious scholarly evidence linking pedophilia with celibacy in a serious way?
No, there's not. On the other hand, there are a lot of ravages of celibacy. And once those occur in a person, it can make them succumb to all kinds of weaknesses, starting with alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Celibacy is a very difficult life to live. That's why I got out of the seminary. But the protection of the priest was greater and worse in effect than that of other kinds of pedophiles. Because the awe of the priest was what they were protecting. And the awe around the priest made the victims vulnerable. You know, a lot of these people met their abuser at their home. And I've talked to a number of them, and the first impulse is not to say anything because they're so confused, and if the priest is doing it, it can't be wrong, and yet it doesn't feel very good. But then, first they deny it themselves. Then, usually, the parents deny it. When you go to the parents, they don't expect that from a priest. And they say, you know, you're exaggerating or whatever. And then, when the family does take it to the diocese in whatever form, usually there's denial there too at first. No, that can't have been. And then there's cover-up. The priest is moved, etc. And the lawyers, the first thing the diocese did, naturally, and I can't blame them, was lawyer up. And the first thing the lawyers said was, don't put any admissions down in any way that will expose you to litigation. So the aura of the priesthood was a continuing factor in the whole thing. It made the hurt deeper, that it was not simply some thug or family member or Boy Scout coach, leader, who violated them. It was the center of their spiritual authority. So celibacy was a bad idea, and I'm glad the priesthood is shrinking because it's a bad idea to keep it up.
I think we have time for two more short questions, so I think we're next, and then...
My family and I...
I'm sorry, she's already had a question, so, right? Go ahead, sir.
No.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, sir, yep.
All right, very good. My family and I lived in South America, Paraguay, and Argentina during the Second Vatican Council. And at that time, we had great association with nuns down there. Later, after the council came out, we returned to the States. We saw the slow degrading of the Catholic nuns, their positions across the United States and also across Central America. We also had a number of priest friends down in South America that were in favor of liberation theology. The papacy came down very, very strongly against that. I see where Pope Francis is beginning to come around, particularly on liberation theology. do we see Francis as a pope that will bring the nuns back into a teaching process and assisting the church? And the second thing is, do we see the Vatican taking care of their financial responsibilities through the Vatican Bank?
I love the nuns. The Dominican nuns of Adrian educated me and steered me, and I kept in touch constantly with one of those teachers until she died. The average age of the nuns, well, I was given an honorary degree from the Dominicans in Adrian, Michigan, my hometown. And when I went there, I was driven around by a 75-year-old nun, and I said, well, you must be about retirement age. And she said, I can't retire. Our retirement home is all filled and overfilled. And then they showed me the big ledger in which the women taking their first vows wrote their names, and there was loaded page after page, lines, thick lines. Now it's down to sometimes 2 coming in, sometimes 3. Will they be revived? No, because this brings us to another of our great American sins, patriarchy. Women didn't have much channel for their energies and imaginations and creativity. Now, women can do all kinds of things they couldn't do when the nuns of my era were there. They couldn't be university presidents other than women's colleges. Law was pretty much sealed to them. They could be nurses, of course, but you can do that as a nun too. But bright, energetic, creative women didn't have many opportunities. The nuns, by becoming nuns, they did have that. So I don't think that that's going to come back. You have to put it in the whole context of our recent history. One of the things that's wonderful about America is that we are a people of change. And I was at an American Bar Association Women's Caucus in the 90s. 10 years before that, there had not even been a women's caucus, women lawyers. And this was a whole big ballroom full of women at table. And when the proceedings began, the woman got up and said, before our speeches, I'd like to ask, who of you attending here was the first woman to be an editor of your law school journal? Who was the first to become senior partner in your law firm? Who was the first to be made district attorney? Who was the first to be made a judge? Who was the first to be made the president of first woman to be made a president of a university? So tens, 12s, et cetera, started standing, then hundreds. This had all happened in their lifetime. They're the founding generation. And I realized then that what was happening in the law was happening in the ministry, in the military, in the academy, in business. I use the Presbyterian Seminary Library on our campus all the time. When I first started going there 30 years ago, there were only young men studying for the ministry. Then there are a scattering of women. Then about half and half. Now there are more women than men. And so that's all happened in my span of time at Northwestern University. So it's not a bad thing that the nuns have disappeared. They're still around doing wonderful things, and many of them are Catholics, and many more are Christians. So we should be happy and proud about that. Barney Frank has a new book out saying, I never thought that gay marriage could be accepted on a wide scale in America. That's happened so fast. The civil rights movement, they say, oh, it got stalled, we don't have any Dr. King anymore. the number of sheriffs and policemen and senators and other things growing all the time, people forget. Every one of those was inconceivable a very short time ago, certainly about half of my lifetime ago.
So I think our final question here.
Yeah, it's, I'd just like to expand a little bit on that, that thought. In Lourdes, there's a church at the top of the hill, and it has this beautiful set of stained glass windows that start with the apparition to Bernadette, a poor girl with bare feet, and ends with the Pope and the cardinals kind of at the other end. And it's pretty quickly that you can see women falling out of the pictures and the poor falling out. And so by the end, it goes from this sort of beautiful simplicity of faith to a whole lot of money and a whole lot of men. And I just wonder if this Pope is willing to or even interested in a serious examination of the role of women in the church and the what the church is losing by excluding their intelligence and creativity and faith from the decision-making processes in the church.
Yeah, that's what some of my friends are saying, that the Pope's not done enough about women. And for a while, he didn't stop that terrible intrusion of investigators into the American convents. He has stopped it now. But once again, you say, is the Pope, no, you said it right, is he considering it deeply enough? He's calling other people to do it. He says we've got to learn the language of women, as we have to learn the language of everybody we go to talk about God's love. So he can't do it from the top, but I think he's certainly encouraging it. And again, we often just walk past these things and say that worked for a while, but it was wrong. As we walked away from usury, etc., we were walking away from patriarchy. In our church, my campus church, we've had 2 women who are the community leaders, each for about 15 years. And when the first one retired, students came back from all around the country saying, when I thought I couldn't make it through in my studies here, it was Mary who helped me. When my fiancé and I broke up, it was Mary that counseled us and brought us back together and prepared us for marriage. Or when some say that when we had children, Mary was the one who catechized them. She ran and in both cases, the priests were wise enough to let them, who are the real leaders of the community, give the homily until Francis George, our cardinal, stopped that. But for a lot of reasons, because of the cultural change, after all, if America just caught up with the importance of women, why should we be surprised that the church is having that slow development too? But nonetheless, it's the same development, and it will speed up to match the things that, because it's happening all around us. You can't start anything now without women's participation, because obviously they're affected by whatever government does. Now, we haven't got equality in Congress and all these other places, but we've certainly got a lot more than before. And the pressures for this change have built a momentum that's going to be hard to stop. And that'll be true of the church, too. It has to be. That's what my theme of the book is, that many of the things that became a burden to the church were actually pretty good at the outset. When authority was only monarchical in the Middle Ages, in order to speak at all, you had to be a monarch. And so the Pope became a monarch. Then he picked up countries, and more countries, and more countries, and more armies, and more torture, and more spies. And so it's understandable why he became a monarch in the first place, but it went on too long and was defended too ruthlessly. So sure, I think this Pope knows that the changes are coming, and he will encourage them, I hope. But again, he lives next door to Benedict. Many people were upset that he accepted people in positions who Benedict had appointed. Well, what do you expect him to do? Affront his predecessor by firing all of his appointees? That would be stupid. This is not a stupid Pope. So the women are going to make a big contribution very shortly. They're already doing it. Oh, and I should say, women theologians were an unheard of thing in my grade school days. Now there are many brilliant ones all over the place. I think of Candida Moss at Notre Dame, for instance.
And Francis has invited female theologians to participate in more activities now. And this female person is going to thank Dr. Wills and thank all of you all for being here this evening.